So today I have the pleasure of introducing the next two speakers. So Anastasia Taylor Lindh is an English-Swedish photographer and a Ruth Cowan Nash Nieman Fellow. Her work as a photojournalist centers around war, women, birth rights, and population, and being featured in many leading publications such as Time, The New Yorker, The Sunday Times Magazine, Telegraph Magazine, and Vanity Fair. In 2014, she published her first book, Maidem: Portraits from the Black Square, which documents the 2014 Ukrainian uprisings in Kiev. While Independence Square was under siege, Anastasia shot a series of photographs of anti-government protesters and mourners made in a makeshift photographic studio just feet away from the barricades. The images captured during the uprising capture an air of stillness and uncertainty, creating a series of images that highlight the impact of unrest of people in Kiev at the time. Her images have been exhibited in spaces such as the Saatchi Gallery, Frontline Club, and the National Portrait Gallery in London. Anastasia often uses postcards, social media, and Instagram as a tool for her work. And then our next speaker is Neil Shea. Growing up near Boston, he is a contributing editor at the Virginia Quarterly Review and the American Scholar, and his work regularly appears in National Geographic. His work has also been featured in other publications, such as Foreign Policy, The Atlantic Monthly, Christian Science Monitor, and Inversion Magazine. Neil's writing has been recognized with Gold and Silver Lowell Thomas Awards for his stories on Ethiopia and Cuba, as well as an award for environmental reporting from the Society of Environmental Journalists. His 2011 story on the Paris catacombs was listed in the Best American Travel Writing, and in 2016 he wrote, produced, and presented his first television documentary, an episode from the Explorer series on the National Geographic Channel. The show, called Fighting ISIS, is based on a feature story he wrote on Iraqi Kurds and their struggle to defend their homeland against ISIS. In a 2015 story, Neil said, quote, Instagram has essentially become one of the world's most successful general interest magazines. An average of 70 million images are uploaded to it daily, and each one represents a page, a story, a sliver of light or perception bouncing in from somewhere around the world. Without further ado, next two speakers.
Thank you. Is my mic on by any chance? Can you hear me okay? Yep, super. Just checking. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about the way I use Instagram. I never imagined that I would be invited to speak about this particular part of the photography that I do, because I'm actually quite a traditional, old-fashioned photojournalist, in the sense that I still shoot analog film, even though most of my colleagues shoot with digital cameras. So really, my conversion to Instagram and social media was unexpected to my colleagues and to me as well. But I just wanted to walk you through that journey a little bit and how I ended up making so many pictures on my iPhone. When I first arrived in Maidan Square in 2014, during the Euromaidan protests, I already knew what the square looked like, because for 2 months, the protesters who'd been running street battles with forces loyal to the government had been protesting and had been covered. These events had been covered extensively by the international media. It seemed that in Maidan, for every person who had something to say, there was someone there to record it. So I knew before I even got there what the square looked like, and that it was dramatic, visually seductive, an architecture full of fire and ice and smoke. And of course, I wasn't the only one that was there. The protesters were very well organized, and so each day we were given a press pass. And on one day, I think I was number 325 of all of the journalists working in the square. So really, it was the presence of my colleagues, many of whom are my friends and who I know from the industry, but it was the presence of my colleagues that really made me start to think, how am I going to approach this subject? Gone are the days when one photojournalist happens to be in one place where a breaking news event is taking place and has to tell the world about it. Social media changed that. Photography became more democratic. People have access to tools in a way that they didn't before, and they're able to tell their own stories. And also, we're all there. So, of course, if I had been the only photographer in Maidan Square, I would have photographed it in a traditional journalistic way. But I wasn't. So I had to think about what can I say about what's happening here that nobody else can? Or how can I speak about these violent events visually in a way that nobody else can? Because when we look at the news from Ukraine, and also when we look at the historical documents from Ukraine and what happened there in 2014, my pictures will only play a small part of that collective documentation. So I wanted to really find a very narrow way, visual language, to speak about this. So I set up a makeshift portrait studio inside the barricades on Hrushevskoho Street, and there I photographed the men as they approached the barriers, the frontline barriers, where they fought with security forces, the Berkut. So I would stop people as they approached the front line and say, "Hi, I'm Nastia." Nastia is the short version of my name, Anastasia in Russian. "Hi, I'm Nastia from London. Can I make your picture?" And for the most part, everybody agreed. But I had a problem because it turned out that I was covering a news event. I hadn't expected to, actually. I was in Ukraine for another story, and I ended up working in Maidan. I was covering a news event, but on analog film. So the photographs I was making, even I couldn't see, because the medium format films were sitting in my apartment just off the square, and waiting for me to take them back to London and to process them at the lab there. So I was frustrated creatively, but also creatively in terms of making something that didn't exist before and sharing it with the world, but also frustrated because it was important what was happening there. It felt important to me that people knew about what was happening, and I couldn't bloody share it. So I started making photographs on my iPhone, which I held above my camera, and just photographed through the viewfinder of my Bronica camera. And I made these pictures. They're on my iPhone. You can see here, this is the focusing loop that I use on the analog camera, and you can see also the lines of the glass prism. So I started making these pictures and going down to the sushi cafe on the corner, which was the nearest place with Wi-Fi to my portrait studio, and from there I could stand outside without even going inside and just upload these pictures from the square. This is eventually what I ended up looking at. It's a contact sheet of the analog film, which I processed. I got to this point of the process probably 3 or 4 weeks later in London. So I ended up making these pictures on my iPhone and through the viewfinders, where I came to this point because of a story that I had committed to telling using social media that never actually happened. It was called Negative Zero. And I lived in London at the time, and I planned to travel all over Europe, visiting countries that were experiencing population decline. And this was going to be my first social media project. In fact, I bought an iPhone for this. So I bought the van, and I decided to document the entire process, because I thought maybe social media or maybe Instagram and maybe iPhone photography had a place in my work, in that I could show the behind the scenes processes of how I work as a photojournalist. So I bought the van. I planned the project, and these are all pictures that I shared via Instagram. I planned the project. I set off for France with 2 of my best friends, 2 photographers. I photographed that. I wasn't really sure what I was going to photograph, so as I got ideas, I wrote them in my notebook, or if I had fears or concerns, I wrote them in my notebook, and I Instagrammed that. And I shared the pictures that I wouldn't usually share. So before iPhone photography and Instagram, usually after spending time with people, one of us would say, "Oh, we've got to get a picture of us together as well, right?" And so we'd have that photograph taken, and for the most part they were out of focus and blurry because nobody could use my big old analog film camera. But with the iPhone it became super easy. So I just shared one picture, this picture, from Romania. And my followers on Instagram said, "Hey, this is kind of interesting." Let's see some more. So then I started, everybody I photographed, everybody I lived with before I left, I would make a picture, have somebody make a picture with them. So I started talking about the process of working as a photographer quite publicly. And this is something that I had understood was not really allowed, because we should be objective and we should be invisible, and it should be about the subjects and it should not be about us. These were the old rules that I'd been taught and that I grew up on. The old rules when photojournalism was something different, and so I started teaching myself the new rules. And it was on this journey that I first started making photographs through my analog camera, because people would write to me my followers would write to me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and say, hey, so what are you up to? Like, I saw you're photographing in Romania, but what are you doing? And so this was a way of previewing what I was doing. I went to a steel factory and I photographed that. In this instance, I had the rolls of film in the back of my van, and I wouldn't see them for 10 weeks until I got back to London and processed them. And it became quite fun, because I'd make pictures like this through the viewfinder and on my iPhone. And then 3 months later, when I actually processed the film and scanned the negatives, I was then able to repost the picture on Instagram and say, hey, you remember this one? Well, here's what it turned out like. So the Bronica and Hasselblads, the medium format cameras, you see everything reversed. That's why here she's facing this way, but the negative, she's facing the other way. And I enjoyed doing this. I never thought that I would enjoy using social media. I'm not particularly tech savvy, or as I said, my process is very old-fashioned and very slow, but it became fun. And people were always interested in the camera that I used, and so I started sharing these kinds of stories. This was the photograph I took at the church service in a village that had the highest birth rate in Romania during Ceausescu's era. And the priest was an amateur photographer, and he loved my camera, so I took this photograph on my iPhone and shared that. And then I continued sharing the process of how I worked when I got home. So I would ask my audience to participate in the selections that I was making. Using this magnifying loop from the contact sheets, I then select which images will be part of my project. So I made iPhone pictures of that process too. You have to get the ground glass cleaned on these cameras, and I don't do it very often, as you can see by the black dots. This was the iPhone picture, and then this was the photograph, the real photograph, if you like. But the problem with telling everybody about what you're doing on social media is that if it goes wrong or you don't end up doing it, everybody knows. And it was while I was shooting this project that I found myself in Maidan and actually abandoned the project altogether and made the portraits of the men who were fighting in the Euromaidan revolution. So for about 2 years after this, my friends and colleagues and people actually I didn't know in the industry would say, oh, so hey, how's that project Negative Zero going? It's a brilliant idea, I can't wait to see it. And I would have to shamefully say, well, actually, I'm not doing that, I'm doing something else instead. And this was my greatest fear, actually, in engaging with social media. I'm English. We have this sense of the stiff upper lip. Like, you must not show failure or self-doubt at any cost. So really, this was the biggest hurdle for me to overcome. Instagram started, introduced the feature where you could share video as well. So this started me thinking. I had no interest in shooting video before, but again, like Instagram and the iPhone became part of my creative process, like my digital notebook. I was thinking, it was a way of thinking through subjects and also sounding them off people. So when I first posted the pictures through the viewfinder, people said, hey, this is kind of cool, we like it, do some more. I really don't think I would have done if I hadn't have had that encouragement. And so my assistant Tom built me this very rudimentary iPhone arm that fixed onto the tripod mount underneath my camera. And this allowed me to fix my iPhone over my camera, and essentially meant that I was hands-free and I could shoot as I would normally and run videos. So this is the results of that.
Can you hold that up? Okay. And your other hand as well. Yeah, yeah. Okay. One more. Yeah, perfect. And last one. Excellent. Hang on.
So this was a way of really including actually my voice, but also talking about the performative element that takes place between photographers and their subjects. But I believe this is the case also in all forms of journalism. There is an element of collaboration and interaction, and there is also, in my photography, the person in the photograph has a degree of authorship over the picture as well. So I wasn't really asking him to pose at all, except to hold his hands up because I couldn't move any further back. This was all him thinking about how he wanted to be presented. So again, it was a way of just thinking about my process a little bit. And so I made these videos before the 20th of February, which was the worst day of violence, and essentially led to President Yanukovych fleeing Ukraine and the Maidan protesters succeeding in their revolution. I made these videos before that violence and also afterwards. So this is a video of one of the medics who helped treat the 50 or so people who were killed by snipers on the morning of the 20th of February. This is a few days afterwards. He's talking to my translator, Emily. You hear her asking me now.
Ah, okay, thank you.
So his suggestion.
Can you keep your hand on it? Thank you. Just 1 second.
So these were notes specifically made for Instagram as an experiment. But actually what I ended up doing was loading the videos back onto iPhones, which I hid in a wall and mounted over real camera viewfinders. So it meant that it was in an analog exhibition of handprints, but underneath on the wall, it meant that people were actually able to go up and see essentially what I saw. Which through the viewfinder, the real viewfinder in the wall, and also with a focusing loop that you could choose to lift or not. So this was very much part of my process of thinking about, well, how do I see the world, and how can I share with you specifically what I see in it? I don't see the world like my photographs, or like you do when you look at my photographs. I always see it as 6 by 6 centimeters, reversed, through this camera that's held at my belly button. The only way I would see the world like my photographs is if I put my camera down and stood there and just looked at what was happening. that's not my job. So the project kind of came full circle, and I ended up exhibiting the videos on the same device that they were recorded on and initially shared on. I hadn't planned that when I started. I didn't know that that was going to happen. So I talked about the 20th of February and the worst day of violence. At that time, I was photographing with a digital camera. And this picture ended up being the front cover of the biggest newspaper in Germany. And when I shot the photograph, I knew that this would probably be the cover image. But today, to wait 24 hours until this picture is on the front page of a newspaper, that just seems ridiculous. Because the situation had changed very quickly in Maidan, and I wanted people to know what was happening now. I was on assignment. I knew this picture would end up, would be seen by lots of people, but it seemed too late. So while I was making photographs on my digital camera for the newspaper, I was also making these pictures on my iPhone, just shooting with the two at the same time. And I really wasn't sure about whether I should share the pictures on Instagram, because at that time we were still thinking of Instagram as like this place where you put nice pictures, like of your dog or your cat, and your friends follow you, and it's about pretty things. And to put pictures of people who'd just been murdered or people who'd been severely injured, I felt there was some kind of ethical dilemma. But I thought it was important to share the pictures, and so I posted them, and I just wrote, because we didn't know, I just wrote, this is what's happening in Maidan Square now. Because I didn't know that there were snipers, that we didn't know it was snipers necessarily who were killing people, although you see they were coming back with holes, they have bullet holes in their heads, but we didn't know exactly what was happening. So journalistically, I couldn't report on it except to say, this is what's happening now. And the reaction to it from my Instagram following was quite strong. Some people thought it was disgusting and that I was using the deaths of other people to increase my following somehow. But actually, I believe, and I wouldn't have such a moral dilemma now. I was using Instagram in the way that citizen journalists use it, to share information on the ground about what's happening in a place. So after that day, I kept photographing in my studio, but instead of photographing the fighters, I stopped women as they came to lay flowers. First on the bloodstains in the square where the men had been killed, and after they covered the bloodstains, they covered the barricades and eventually the whole square. So this became my first book, the most traditional form of way of presenting photographs that there is, a book of photographs printed on paper. But that wasn't for another 8 months or so. So all this to say, I really focus on this marriage of traditional analog storytelling and also innovative digital experimentation. And last summer, I used social media again to find some of the people that I'd photographed, because I didn't know it would be a book. I didn't take anyone's email addresses, and I just had no way of contacting them. So we started a social media campaign in the Ukrainian media and also on Ukrainian social media, including Facebook and VKontact, and we started posting photographs and saying, we're looking for the people in these photographs. Do you know who they are? And so I was able to find people and visit them and give them a copy of the photograph eventually. So yeah, the way that I'm using social media is quite, comes at it from all directions. So just very quickly with some technical things. I take all my pictures on Camera Plus. It's a camera app. There are others that are good, but this is the one that I use. Then I edit those pictures. It's on Snapseed. It's like a mini version of Photoshop. And then I share them on Instagram, using Instagram as the main platform, and then linking that to Twitter and Facebook. And then I download the pictures using image capture on my computer to archive them. So the workflow is a little bit different with analog films, where I'd write a number on the film and then correlate that number to the captions. I'm sorry, I've totally gone over time here. So just very quickly to wrap this up, because I know we're a bit tight. I am now working on a project that completely that uses the audience I built, my Instagram following, that uses the audience that I built to participate in my project. So I'm still working in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, where a war is still ongoing. And from eastern Ukraine, I am sending real touristic postcards that were produced before the war, this series called Welcome to Donetsk. And on the back of those postcards, I am writing one name of one person who's been killed and posting these cards to strangers all over the world. We've sent 2,000 postcards so far to more than 60 countries. And postcards are, again, a very old-fashioned, traditional, analog way of telling somebody a story in a very personal way. But I need my social media following to participate in this project because I need the addresses of people to send the postcards to. So this is, so I use Instagram to call for people to participate in my project. And then what they do is send me their address, and I write the name of one person who's been killed onto the back of a postcard and send it to them from Ukraine. And those people then use social media to tell the story themselves of that person who's been killed. And they sent me videos and photographs made on iPhones that talk about their response. Initially, I was writing the postcards myself. Now I'm coordinating teams of volunteers in Ukraine from both geographical sides of the conflict. And there's a short video of some of these responses.
Ned was killed in Lugansk on Wednesday the 25th of June, 2014.
Anatoly Litvinenko was killed in Diakovo on Thursday, the 12th of June, 2014.
On Wednesday, 9th of July 2014, when Vladimir Kostyonov was killed in Lugansk.
Alla Kolomowitz was killed in Luhansk on Friday the 9th of August 2014.
Andy Gridson was killed in Donetsk airport on Tuesday the 20th of January 2015.
Roman Piesuk was killed in Zlatoustivka on Tuesday the 10th of March 2015.
Thank you.
I'm curious, how many of you have an Instagram account? How many of you have more than one? If you have two, raise your hand. Now that you can do that cool thing. Anybody, so you have two. Other people have two? Does anybody have three? I think I have four. But how many of you are on Snapchat? And Facebook? And whatever else? Right? So this is a room full of multiple personalities. Because each one of these platforms that you put stuff out on is a different personality, right? So it's fascinating how this comes to journalism now and makes journalism, which is like still something that I think of as like my dad's thing. Like my dad reads the newspaper. I don't do that shit. But so even that journalism was a kind of personality. And the journalism that you're all doing, it represents some sort of personality, right? It's if you're writing stories, a little bit of you is in that. If you're taking photographs, a little bit of you is in that. So when Instagram sort of changed the way that Anastasia and I do journalism, it's interesting because it also changes the way not only we work, but also the way we think of our work and also who we are. Because in all the stories that I've written for National Geographic over the years, it's, I don't know, more than double-digit stories, I very rarely get anybody to respond to what I've done. Unless it's this peculiar type of nerd who writes in to be like, that fucking mountain is 3,000 feet tall, not 2,500 feet tall. So this is the kind of thing that people will write to National Geographic about. Like, you spelled that tribe's name wrong. Like, sorry. And but normally, so we don't get much feedback. The most feedback I've actually gotten at National Geographic is prisoners. people incarcerated will write me letters. And I don't know if it's because they actually read National Geographic or they're just looking for a pen pal. But it's interesting. Instagram has changed all that. I get so much feedback, and some of it is so hateful that I don't even know what to do with it. So, but it's interesting because we're reaching a totally different audience that National Geographic could never have expected to reach and still doesn't know what to do with. So I'll talk a little bit about what I have been doing with Instagram, and I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way and just call up things on the internet. Here we go. My conversion to Instagram was much like Anastasia's. I didn't really get into it at first. I started in newspapers and saw sort of the death of newspapers, and then I went to magazines and they're dying too. So I guess I get to see the death of Instagram whenever that comes around. But all of this is just a lot of hype. There's always a new way to tell stories, and there's actually never been a better time to tell stories than now, as all of you probably know. There's never been more resources dedicated to storytelling and more platforms to tell stories on. The problem with this is, though, how are we going to do it? How are we going to be heard in all of this noise? And that's sort of our challenge if we are in the business of telling stories. For people who just want to consume stories, they can do anything they want, can't they? This evening you will do it many times. Probably already today you've done it many times when you check whatever you check. You're engaging with a story. So the question for us who make these stories or who bring these stories to the audience is, how are we going to be heard? How are we going to be seen? How are we going to get paid if we actually think that getting paid is something that happens anymore in this kind of business? It's a struggle. And I was getting a little bit tired of the journalism that I used to do, that I still do, long-form journalism. Like even that word long form, it's kind of boring. Like it sounds like I'm going to be doing my homework. You know, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read a story, and I'm going to get fucking educated about something, right? It's just going to be, I'm going to get it. So I didn't want to do that. Never wanted to be that kind of writer. I never wanted to be that kind of journalist who sort of force-fed facts. And this is an interesting debate that I have with some of my older colleagues, is sort of, what does journalism do? What is its purpose? And how do we present people with something called objective, fact-based reporting in a way that sort of reaches them? Because I bet, how many of you are college, sort of university newspaper editors, things like that? You actually read other newspapers? You do. So this is an unusual crowd. You know this about yourselves already, right? It's very difficult to find. I teach across the river at Boston University. Most of my students don't read the newspaper until they come to my classes, and I force them to. But they still all want to be journalists. So there's this disconnect that we have to find a way to bridge. Journalism, Instagram is helping me do that, and it's the latest way that I've found to tell the stories that I want to tell, which are entirely based in factual journalism of the kind that you learn in universities now, that you learn in your internships, and that you're doing at the newspapers and magazines that you work at. But what Instagram does is it allows us to do different experiments with the way that we tell stories, with the voice that we use, with the style that we present things in. So we're freed from some of the conventions of normal journalism. And by normal, I just sort of, for this audience, I mean mainstream American media, not TV. Okay, we're mostly talking the print variety here. So it's allowed me to experiment. And Instagram is also an interesting design challenge because it's a square, right? At least it was when I started. Now it's moved on from that. And we only get 300 words, which in the Instagram world is very long. But as any of you know who've written, it's not very long at all. It seems like barely enough to take a breath, barely enough to tell something interesting. So I was convinced to do this finally when I went to Africa, to Kenya and Ethiopia specifically. And I had already begun to use my iPhone as part of my reporting tool. Some people use tape recorders, or they used to use tape recorders, they use digital recorders, whatever. I have always been a notebook person. I just wrote everything down. And I brought a camera with me, but I didn't use it that much. But with the iPhone, I started to make sure that I would take a portrait of whoever I was interviewing or whoever I was talking with. And that's something that you should probably be doing anyway, right? You should have a record of whoever you spoke to, because it's so easy now. And when you go back to write your stories or do whatever, you can see who you've talked to. And they're with you, they're present in your mind. So I thought that if I'm already taking pictures of people with my iPhone, and I already have their story in my notebook, it seemed like a natural thing to do to combine into Instagram stories. And at first I thought that I would just write little things, little portraits to go with the photo. I'll move over here for a second. And so I did that with people who let's see, this young woman in particular. So we took, this was the photographer I was working with. He happened to take this photograph. But I talked with her. I stood and watched as she milked this cow every day. So I had the story in my notebook, and it was never going to go into National Geographic magazine, which would never write about one particular individual doing this every morning. But the scene from my notebook fit perfectly into this format. And using it this way, I could create a little view into this world that people would never otherwise see. So that's sort of where I got my start with it. Just sort of playing around with this idea of putting a picture and words together the way that they naturally want to be. You've heard a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Sometimes we wonder which 1,000 words it's worth. Is it actually worth 1,000 words? So Instagram slowly became this drafting board for me. It became like a mobile studio where I could try out different versions of the story before I put it together into the magazine form. I would develop scenes. I would practice writing about characters. I could do anything I wanted with Instagram because at the time, nobody was really looking at it for that kind of journalism. There was nobody else doing this kind of writing on the platform. So, and even my employers, National Geographic, they still don't pay attention to it. It's like I can do anything I want on Instagram, and even though they're one of the largest media companies in the world, they're not paying attention to it. I'll get to that later. Eventually, what the photographer I was working with, his name is Randy Olson, wonderful photographer. He and I realized that we could use Instagram to tell the stories that were not making it into the magazine. And that's what we started to do on Instagram, on National Geographic's feed account, or its feed. And what we realized was that partly because nobody was paying attention yet, we could tell anything we wanted to tell, which when you're a journalist is kind of cool because the editors aren't involved. Right? It's like you've been given the keys to the car and nobody's telling you how to drive. You can just do whatever you want. So it was interesting, but it was also scary because we didn't know what we were going to post and we didn't know what rules we had to work with. So we had to make up the rules as we went. And we based them thoroughly in the journalism that we'd been doing for years. But we freed ourselves to tell stories in slightly different ways. So our first experiment was with the Omo River in southern Ethiopia, which is one of the last sort of intact tribal landscapes in Africa. And it's, of course, what's the story here? We know what National Geographic writes about. Their world is being destroyed by the forces of evil and Western development and things like this. So we were actually fortunate enough to see this world right as it was about to change, as this tribal landscape was going to be wiped away by big cotton plantations and sugar plantations and mining and things like this. This photograph did appear in National Geographic magazine, but almost every other one that we posted to Instagram did not. So we set ourselves a challenge, and for about 2 weeks, we posted one photo a day at roughly the same time every day. I won't go through them all, but these are the kinds of images. This image in particular did not get published in National Geographic magazine for whatever reason. That's a photo editor's decision. But Randy came back from the field, as most photographers do, with thousands of images. And we wanted to find a home for them. We wanted to be able to tell the story of this woman and why she had dressed herself this way, why she was wearing a lip plate, things that we didn't get to talk about in the print magazine. So 300 words or slightly less, it's not that big of a commitment. And once people started to realize that we were doing this, they came back to Instagram every day to check in with what we were telling next. And they started to, I just looked at this one, they started to interact with us in a way that never happens in the magazine. 5,000 comments. That's not, we don't know what that means, because some of the comments are just like, ridiculous, right? You can imagine what they might say about this picture. But some of the comments were really interesting, and it led people to the magazine story. And then they came back to Instagram and were asking us questions about the magazine story on Instagram. So it was this strange feedback that we'd never seen before. Here's another couple more photos, just to move through them. This one got, for some reason, well, not for some reason, a lot of people from the NRA really love this photograph. You can imagine why. And this is part of the beauty of a story, and also its danger, is that when you put a story out into the world, you never know what people are going to attach to it, right? They're going to attach their own story to the story that you're sharing. So this, I never wrote this for the NRA, but the NRA really liked it. And they started to use it for their own purposes in strange ways. Let's see here. Another couple of images. Boys in a small village during a dust storm. And of course, this was, I think, the most popular image during this particular series. Why is it so popular? Kid and a monkey, right? But it also got perhaps the most racism of the entire series.
That lends itself to racism.
It absolutely does. And so this is a fascinating question that we didn't even realize we were getting into, that Instagram forced us to start thinking about our own work in a different way. And the photographer, to his credit, he was like, this just happened. I just took a picture of it. This kid just walked by. This is a question, this is a good question for another time, is what are the ethics of using social media? Because people aren't interacting with it in a necessarily a really deep way, what is our responsibility as journalists when we put an image like this out, or a story like this out? Do we have any responsibility? Often journalists say, I'm just observing, this is what I saw. But is that valid anymore in a world of social media and very quick responses? More people like this than almost anybody, than liked almost any other image on National Geographic for a long time. And most of them, we think, liked it because it just seems to be nice. It's like an animal, a kid. These two things go together. We like them. And that's really something that we can't, when we click on the heart, we don't really know why people are doing it or what we're getting. And this is what most media has not figured out yet, is what does a like mean? What does a like lead to? If I look quickly, let's see here. What we did to keep these stories all together. This is 2 series. We invented a hashtag, a unique hashtag to keep them organized and keep them together. So National NG Watershed Stories, because we were telling stories of a watershed. They were we did, I don't know, 20-something posts. They were reposted or posted again, taken, changed, edited, cropped, and reposted this many times. The number of likes we had from these 2 series was something like 12 million. Now that's more than the subscriber base of National Geographic, which goes out to something like 26 different countries. But do we know what to do with that number? Do we know what that number actually means? We don't. All we know about it really is that it's engagement. It's some kind of engagement. And still, National Geographic does not know what to do with it. So this is the challenge that media companies are now facing, is what do they do with something like Instagram? What do they do with social media? Like this. Here's a few images from our next series. We followed the river down from Ethiopia into northern Kenya, where it pours into Lake Turkana, which is the largest desert lake in the world. This is, again, a story that we did for the magazine, but that actually got more traction on Instagram. We'll just go through some of these photos quickly. These are flamingos. Something like 150,000 flamingos in one place. It's a young woman milking. These are guys who are fishing underwater with spears. And these are part of what we were doing here, is documenting these last tribes right before they get pushed aside by other colonial forces or forces of development. So as we went and documented this in the magazine, we organized this series to appear when the story in the magazine came out. So the Instagram series and the magazine story happened at the same time. And they reach totally different audiences. Because how many of you subscribe to National Geographic? Wow, thank you. And how many of you follow it on Instagram? And around the world, it's like, I think it's still true that it's got the most followers of any non-celebrity account. Something like that. It's a ridiculous number. So we're reaching people who would not subscribe to the magazine. And we're offering a view into not a story as it comes together, but also photographs and text stories that would never see the light of day, that could never be published in the magazine. So Instagram has become this way that we can share with a much wider and much more varied audience across the world. This is an interesting one because a lot of people like this. Actually, Anastasia talked about this. The way she didn't know whether or not to post pictures of violence on Instagram because was kind of not what it's for. There's an interesting trend here where you can post a picture of an animal and people will like the shit out of it. You post a picture of a certain kind of person or a certain sort of abstract thing, fewer people will like it. And David Gutenfelder, a very well-respected photographer, was telling me once that whenever he posts a black and white picture, he would lose like 1,000 followers. And then he'd post a color picture and he'd gain them all back. And I don't think he can even tell if he can lose 1,000 followers anymore. His numbers are so big that it's just mind-blowing. But what we did with this one is that we posted a picture of a crocodile and then actually told a story about what it was like to stand on the shore of this lake and wonder if you could go swimming or not. And then we posted with it a picture of a guy who had survived a crocodile attack. And we wrote in his voice. So this is a sort of a non-traditional, at least from a newspaper perspective, a non-traditional voice and style. We pretty much gave him the keys to the car and said, tell us your story. Of course, I edited it, and I wrote it so that it flowed well and it was in English, obviously. But he told us about his recurring nightmare of the crocodile crawling into his house trying to get him. And this was a more powerful way of reaching people and telling them about it than I could have done in print. And people still write to me about this story because it's just astounding to live through a crocodile attack and then to dream about the crocodile coming for you every night. It's sort of amazing. And then just really quickly, the other way that we've started to use it is finally we've been given sort of official permission to do this at National Geographic. This is the first officially sanctioned Instagram story on National Geographic. And it was a photographer named Yuri Kozyrev and I, who were in northern Iraq to document the Kurds and their battle against ISIS. We all know who ISIS is. Most of you probably know who the Kurds are. So we were able to do this story in the magazine, and then we were also able to tell it on Instagram. What we did here, this photograph was published in the magazine, but the caption in the print version was like 2 lines long, so we just got to say something like, look at the Kurds playing volleyball. But in the caption, we were able to tell a much more interesting story about what was happening. And the fact is that the front line is right here. They're playing volleyball at the front line. ISIS is like 1 bullet away from this scene. We could never get that across in print. But here we have the opportunity to give a lot more context to what's happening. And then we also mixed in photographs that were not available in the print version. And we're able to tell the story of this young woman and her uncle plowing this is a wooden plow. You know, a couple of hours drive from like the oil capitals of the Middle East, right? So it's sort of an amazing contrast, and we would never have been able to do it in print. This is one of the more powerful of the pieces, I think. These are Yazidi women who survived. The woman here in the middle is the mother, her daughter-in-law, and her daughter. And the daughter-in-law and the daughter were captured by ISIS and became sexual slaves of ISIS fighters. And they were able later to escape. And the reason that Yuri, they were willing to do the photograph, but they didn't want their faces to be shown, so they agreed to do this. And then we wrote the story in their voice, or actually in the voice of the mother, and told the story of being captured and escaping, coming back from the dead. And this was one of the most powerful pieces we were able to do from Iraqi Kurdistan. And again, it was a story that we didn't tell in the magazine because the magazine story just went in a different direction. So I will wrap it up so we can talk a little bit about this stuff. But I just wanted to say that what has always struck me is that Instagram now has, 400 million users? Something like that? That's more than the population of the United States, right? So that's huge. Instagram is now a country unto itself, in a way, isn't it? And I think of it as either a country or sort of a galaxy, all these little points of light that are reflecting back some piece of reality to us. And if, as journalists, we can tap into this, it's an extremely powerful way for us to tell the stories that we're working on, or to show people the stories that we think they should be interested in. And because it's social media, we get an opportunity to interact with people who we'd never interact with in our print publications. I just look at the comments on this one. I don't know how many were, 3,000, almost 4,000 comments. And some of the other images got so much hate. This is an ISIS fighter, actually. This is what ISIS looks like, if any of you were curious. A guy who was captured when he went home to visit his mother. So here we were able to do something interesting where we actually gave a little bit of a voice to an ISIS fighter in a way that we hadn't seen before. We got to talk about him as not just some bad guy, but a bad guy with a mother, which does complicate, unfortunately, our picture of ISIS, doesn't it? We can't just blow them off quite as well as we did before. I think this is the most beautiful thing that social media can do if we're not just using it for fun. If we're thinking of it as journalists, this is the sort of thing that we can use it for. It doesn't all have to be happy cats and lattes and things like that. There's a place for that. There's also a place for this kind of thing. And if we can use our skills as journalists to do this and reach people, then we have this amazing platform that really is not being used for this yet. The New York Times, just quickly, does it, and they probably do it the best. If you go to their feed and you click on the link, it will take you to a dedicated page where the New York Times, much like Instagram, but with a bit more text, it's actually more like Tumblr in a way. These are the pictures that appear on their Instagram feed, and you can click and go directly to their stories. Strangely enough, this is like a weird commercial site that the New York Times is subcontracted out to that tries to make money from Instagram, which is a weird thing that as journalists will pretend we didn't hear about. National Geographic, on the other hand, doesn't have its act together with Instagram. If you click on their link, you just go to the website, which is like mummies and sandcastles and starfish and space, and like there's no way you can directly get to the content that you're interested in on Instagram. It's a different beast. If you click on this photograph of the, is that a cougar, a mountain lion? If you click on nationalgeographic.com, it will not take you to any information about that animal or about any of these photographs. So there's a disconnect there that has yet to be taken advantage of. And that's sort of like where you all will come in. Because the media, the newsrooms of today don't really know what to do with this stuff. And they're still trying to figure it out. Even the Times is a little uncertain about how to treat new media, and particularly Instagram. So the fact that you are all already users of it means that you're at an advantage, and you will be the ones to decide what happens next with this platform. So, all right, let's take some questions. Oh, no clapping. Let's just talk. Let's just talk.
And the thing that I'm so excited about is that we all thought from the beginning that Instagram was... We all thought that Instagram was just for photographers.
Aye.
So now we're even getting writers to come over to our side, right? That's kind of fun for us, I think.
It's a fascinating thing because some of you may know that Anastasia is up for an award for her brilliant piece in the Nieman magazine, a written piece. So she's also a writer, and I'm also a photographer. And many of you are probably the same, right? We tend to get wrapped up into boxes so easily. It's like when I was coming up through the business, it's like you're a writer, you're not a photographer. Or you're a photographer, words, whatever. So they don't mix, but that's not true anymore.
Yeah, I'm with the Daily Collision at UMass, and I'm the first photo editor ever, the editor-in-chief, and it's like, well, what are you doing there? And like, well, I have the ability to do both, and so do you. So how do you, as photographers and writers, kind of like break the barrier and say like, photos are an incredible way to tell a story, and you can also do that. Like, how do you just kind of break down the mental models that people have about photography and photographers and realize that the more you practice it and try new things, you can tell amazing stories with it?
That is a great question, and I'm also trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Because we don't really know the answer totally to that. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we can say is, well, we're all storytellers, and let's not limit ourselves. I mean, because I've been limiting. I decided I wanted to be a photographer when I was 16, and I've made pictures up until now. I've only made pictures because I am only a photographer, and I walked away from so many amazing stories I wanted to tell because they weren't visual, and that was a mistake. I think now if we can blur those boundaries a bit and think, what's the best way to tell the story? How can we react in service of the story rather than the boxes that we all live in? But it's hard because we all face that. And in fact, you're the only writer I know that is using Instagram.
There are slowly others. I think this might be I didn't really get to talk about it, but one of the most exciting things that I've found about Instagram is that it lets writers and photographers collaborate in ways that they really couldn't do before. And so maybe that's part of the conversation, is how can we as storytellers collaborate better using this kind of media? Because it's true that, because I've been practicing writing for 10 years, I'm better at it than I am at photography. And a photographer is better at it than I am. Or is better at photography than at writing. So maybe it needs to be more of a discussion about collaboration. But yeah.
But also, this question has been viewed in the traditional media as like, it's been framed like this: oh, now as the budgets are being cut, I've got to go out and take bloody pictures as well as doing the writing, and no one's going to be paying me anymore for this. Or photographers say, those writers stealing our jobs. Now they're going to get one person, there is truth in that. But also, as this happens, I think it allows us, I would never have been brave enough to try and write something even 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And now it gives me confidence as well to move outside of that. And actually, I hadn't thought about writing stories as captions before, because I still had my photography hat on until I haven't done it yet. But I'm inspired to since I saw your short stories. Like I'm thinking, oh, maybe I could give that a go.
You should. Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Neil. So this is more has to do with sort of a writing-based question of ethics, because I noticed when you were talking about the man whose voice you said, I think the phrasing was we wrote the story in their voice rather than saying we translated their story, so which I associate that phrasing with more like I guess sort of I feel like I hear that more in like fictionalizations or I don't know. I guess I'm curious how you stay cognizant. I'm sure this is something that you must be aware of all the time as reporters for National Geographic of this sort of intrusiveness of being in these other cultures. And I guess I'm wondering, like, when you're editing these stories, when you're telling them from the perspectives of the people in the photographs, how do you maintain an awareness of the accuracy and making sure that you're not sensationalizing their stories for public consumption?
Well, that's an extremely valuable question, because that discussion is ongoing now and nobody has the answers. But first of all, I would say that sensationalism is sort of is Donald Trump sensational? Is he?
Is he sensational?
Yeah.
Well,
is he sensationalistic?
I mean,
when we write about him, is he?
Yeah.
Really? I don't know. It's just an interesting question. So this is what I'm dealing with. It's sort of like, did I tell that story? Did I make it sensational? I don't know. Is being chomped by a crocodile and escaping from it sensational? Am I supposed to downplay that? Am I supposed to play it up? So this is a thing that occurs to me, and I'm always trying to be aware of it. And because I've been a journalist for so long before social media arrived, I've had the benefit of being steeped in normal newsroom protocol, normal magazine protocol. At National Geographic, there's an entire floor full of people who fact check my work. So I'm used to having to deal like, oh shit, if I write this, what will they do? So I've been for a decade in the practice of making sure that everything is accurate. So I come to this with that in the back of my mind. And I'm constantly running this through my head saying, will this stand up? How will this play? If a fact checker from National Geographic went to this, what would they find? Would they be able to, take my notebooks and go to the person and say, is this true? So it's a constant conversation that I'm having. One of the things that I'm always careful to say is that this is not sort of normal journalism. And I've been clear on that from the beginning. This is something that some other writers will describe it differently, but for me it's almost more like poetry when it's on social media, because there isn't enough room to fit a lot of facts in. So it really has to be a very tight narrative. So I'm really looking for narrative, and that's what I'm trying to do, is tell a story like this. So this guy's story, this particular guy's story, I went back through my notebooks, I gathered his story, I read it several times, and then I presented it this way. I could have presented it a different way. I could have just sort of written it straight up, but my choice was to do it this way.
But do you worry about the fact that if it could be presented in a different way, if that's not his authentic voice, or if it's sort of an appropriation of his story rather than his actual story? Is that,
yes.
How do you... Yeah.
You just, eventually, every writer, every photographer has to make a deal. And you're sort of like, this is how I'm going to do it. And sometimes you'll have this experience if you're in the business long enough. People will come back to you and say, that wasn't my fucking story. And it happens. But other people will come back, and most people will come back and say, thank you for telling me my story. I don't know what this gentleman would think if I brought him that story back and sort of translated it into Turkana and read it back to him. But what I am sure about is that the facts in that story would hold up. So the narrative structure, it's an open question. It can always be picked apart. But the factual pieces of it, I believe they would stand up.
Guys, I'm so sorry we're out of time for questions, but we will. I'm sure that if you want to share your contact information, or if you want to continue in contact with them, that they can answer questions. We're going to move right now to the lightning round. So join me in thanking our